What if the person you trusted most in the world betrayed you? A marriage built on love slowly unravels as secrets, lies, and an affair with a dangerous man come to light. Will they find redemption, or is it the end of everything they've ever known? Watch as trust is tested and lives hang in the balance. Can love survive the ultimate betrayal? Stay tuned to find out. Elliot Grayson stared out the window of his modest Asheville home, the warm glow of the sunset casting long shadows across the living room. A glass of bourbon sat untouched on the coffee table, condensation pooling beneath it. His eyes, usually calm and steady, were now clouded with unease. Something had shifted in his marriage, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Rebecca had been distant for weeks. Her laughter, once a melody that filled the house, had turned into short, clipped chuckles over texts she didn't share. Her once vivid green eyes barely met his anymore, always darting toward her phone, which now seemed permanently glued to her hand. Tonight she was late again. The excuse was a client dinner, but Elliot's instincts told him otherwise. The shrill buzz of Rebecca's phone startled him from his thoughts. It sat on the kitchen counter, vibrating against the granite like an accusing finger. Normally, she would never leave it unattended. This lapse was new and telling. Elliot hesitated for only a second before picking it up, his thumb trembling as he unlocked it. They didn't have secrets, or so he thought. A text preview glared back at him. "I can't wait for Friday. Everything's set. Just you and me." His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He didn't recognize the number, but the implication was clear. He scrolled further, but the messages were gone, deleted. The phone buzzed again, this time with Rebecca's name flashing on the caller ID. Elliot quickly placed it back where he found it and walked to the living room, his mind racing. "Hey, sorry I'm late," Rebecca called as she entered, her voice overly cheery. She kissed his cheek, a fleeting peck that felt rehearsed. She dropped her purse onto the couch and began rambling about the demanding client. Elliot listened in silence, his face unreadable. "That must have been quite the dinner," he said after a pause, his tone light but edged with something sharp. Rebecca froze for half a beat, her eyes flicking to him before she busied herself unpacking her bag. "It was," she replied quickly, "long but productive." Elliot's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before turning away. His stomach churned with the weight of his discovery, but he knew he couldn't confront her, not yet. He needed clarity, proof, a reason beyond a single ambiguous message. Until then, he would wait, watch, and piece together the truth. As the night wore on, Elliot lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Rebecca slept soundly beside him, her back turned. The rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing seemed almost mocking. In the darkness, his thoughts spiraled. Memories of their early days flooded his mind. Their laughter, their shared dreams, the promises they'd made. How had they ended up here? The next morning, Rebecca left early, claiming another meeting. Elliot stood at the window watching her drive away. The house felt eerily quiet without her. On a whim, he walked over to her purse, still slung over the back of a dining chair. He hesitated, the weight of betrayal pressing against his chest. But his hands moved almost of their own accord, rifling through the contents. Among the mundane, lipstick, receipts, and gum wrappers, was an unfamiliar keycard. The logo read, Haven Crest Resort. Elliot's jaw tightened. This wasn't for work. He knew it instinctively. A pit formed in his stomach, equal parts anger and heartbreak. He stared at the card, its shiny plastic surface reflecting the sunlight streaming through the window. A part of him wanted to storm out and confront her, but another part, the rational, calculating part, held him back. If she was hiding something, confronting her now would only drive it deeper into the shadows. By the time Rebecca returned that evening, Elliot had already slipped the keycard back into her bag, his face a mask of calm. She smiled at him as if nothing were wrong, her voice sweet as she asked about his day. Elliot responded in kind, his voice steady, his demeanor warm. But beneath the surface, his resolve hardened. Whatever was going on, he would find out. And when he did, she wouldn't see it coming. Elliot stood in the kitchen, carefully placing the finishing touches on the anniversary dinner he had spent hours preparing. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary wafted through the air, mingling with the soft glow of candles he had meticulously arranged. On the table sat a single red rose, its petals perfect, a silent symbol of his love. Tonight was meant to be special, a reminder of what they once had. But Rebecca was late, again. He checked the clock for the 5th time in as many minutes. The soft tick-tock seemed to echo louder, mocking the silence that filled the house. His phone buzzed and his chest tightened with hope, only for it to deflate when he saw her text. Running late. Client meeting. Don't wait up. Elliot stared at the screen, his vision blurring with a mix of disbelief and sadness. It wasn't just the text, it was the cold detachment of it. No apology, no explanation, just another excuse in a growing list of them. The dinner sat untouched as he slumped into a chair, his hands running through his hair. His thoughts circled back to the keycard he had found earlier that day, the cryptic text message from the night before, and Rebecca's increasingly erratic behavior. A hollow ache settled in his chest. He had wanted this evening to bring them closer, to reignite the connection they seemed to have lost. Instead, it felt like another crack in an already fragile foundation. Hours passed. The candles burned low, their wax pooling on the table. Elliot couldn't bring himself to blow them out. It felt too final, as if extinguishing them would mean accepting what he feared most, that Rebecca was slipping away from him. When the sound of the front door finally broke the stillness, it was well past midnight. Rebecca walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She froze momentarily, her eyes darting to the untouched table and the cold dinner. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, her voice laced with discomfort. She set her purse down, her movements stiff, almost defensive. "I told you I'd be late." Elliot's eyes met hers, the warmth that once filled them replaced by a quiet intensity. "You forgot, didn't you?" His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "Forgot what?" she asked, a hint of irritation creeping into her tone. "Our anniversary," he said simply. The words were sharp, cutting through the space between them. Rebecca's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. She glanced at the table again, her expression faltering. I'm sorry, Elliot. Work has been demanding." "Demanding enough to forget us?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it lingered, heavy and raw. Rebecca sighed, brushing past him to head upstairs. "I'm tired. We'll talk tomorrow." Elliot sat in silence as her footsteps faded. The air around him felt suffocating, thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. He looked at the table once more, the candles now just smoldering wicks. A bitter thought crossed his mind. Maybe she had forgotten them a long time ago. The next morning, Elliot found himself unable to shake the previous night's events. He scrolled through his phone, replaying the moments leading to their anniversary's collapse. As he did, a name stood out in his call logs, Laura Mayfield. She had been his sounding board in recent weeks, her advice steady and unflinching. "Laura," he said when she picked up, "I think I'm losing her." "Elliot, if you're right about Rebecca, then this isn't just about forgetting anniversaries. You need to figure out what's really going on, but be careful. You might not like what you find." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He thanked her and hung up, staring out the window at the morning sun breaking through the trees. The day was bright, but it felt cold. Somewhere deep down he knew Laura was right. The question was whether he was ready to face the truth. Elliot glanced at the empty table before clearing away the plates and wilting rose. Whatever came next, he needed to be prepared, for both the answers and the fallout. Elliot parked his car at the far end of the lot, angling it behind a delivery truck for cover. From his vantage point, he could see the glass front of the cafe where Rebecca had said she'd be meeting a client. The place was buzzing with the morning crowd, sunlight streaming through the large windows, casting long shadows on the polished tables. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest, a mix of guilt and determination fueling his actions. He had told himself he wasn't the kind of man who spied on his wife, but then again, he never thought he'd need to be. Through the window, he spotted her. Rebecca was seated in a corner booth, her back to the wall, her face animated as she spoke. Opposite her sat a man, sharp in a tailored suit, his easy smile and confident demeanor oozing charm. Elliot's jaw tightened as he recognized Jackson Reed. He had seen photos of the man during his late-night search, and the reality was no less infuriating. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her hand brushing against Jackson's on the table. The intimacy of the gesture made Elliot's stomach churn. For a moment he questioned whether he had misread the situation. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding, a coincidence. But the way Rebecca laughed at something Jackson said, a sound Elliot hadn't heard from her in months, shattered that fleeting hope. Pulling out his phone, Elliot snapped a few pictures. His hands trembled, but he steadied himself, focusing on capturing evidence rather than succumbing to the wave of emotions crashing over him. He couldn't confront her yet. Not here, not without understanding the full extent of her betrayal. Inside the cafe, the conversation shifted. Rebecca's laughter faded, replaced by a serious expression as Jackson slid a folder across the table. She glanced around nervously before opening it, revealing what looked like a legal document. Elliot couldn't see the details, but he could sense the gravity of the moment. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't harmless. Elliot's mind raced. Was Jackson manipulating her, or was she willingly complicit in something he couldn't yet comprehend? The ambiguity gnawed at him, and he hated himself for not storming in and demanding answers. But Laura's voice echoed in his head, "Be careful. You might not like what you find." As Rebecca and Jackson stood to leave, Elliot ducked lower in his seat, his heart pounding. They exited the cafe together, their laughter floating on the breeze. Jackson opened the passenger door of a sleek black car, a gesture that seemed almost rehearsed, and Rebecca slipped inside without hesitation. Elliot clenched his fists, feeling an overwhelming urge to follow them. But he resisted, knowing that his next move needed to be deliberate. Rushing into confrontation would only put Rebecca on guard. Instead, he turned the engine and drove away, his mind already formulating his next steps. Later that day, Elliot shared the photos with Laura. They sat in her office, the blinds drawn to keep out the harsh afternoon light. Laura studied the images carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't just an affair," she said finally, her tone heavy with implication. "Whatever's in that folder, they're planning something." Elliot exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "And I have no idea what it is." "Not yet," Laura replied, her voice softening, "but we'll figure it out. You're not alone in this, Elliot." Her reassurance brought a small measure of comfort, but it didn't erase the burning questions in his mind. What was Rebecca hiding, and how deep did Jackson's influence run? That night, Elliot returned home to find Rebecca already in bed, her back turned to him as she scrolled through her phone. He hesitated at the doorway, watching her in silence. The woman he had loved so deeply felt like a stranger, and yet some part of him still clung to the hope that he could save whatever was left of their marriage. "Good night," she murmured without looking up, her voice distant. Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his chest. If Rebecca had chosen to walk in Jackson's shadow, then Elliot would ensure she realized the cost of that choice. The hum of the office air conditioner filled the quiet as Emily Carter tapped away at her keyboard. Rebecca had just stepped out for a client call, leaving her desk scattered with papers and a half-finished latte. Emily barely glanced up as Elliot walked in, his presence unexpected but strangely reassuring. "Elliot!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying both surprise and warmth. "What brings you here?" He smiled faintly, though the weight of his purpose kept his expression subdued. "Just stopping by to drop off something Rebecca forgot at home." Emily gestured toward Rebecca's desk. "She's on a call, but you can leave it there." As Elliot moved closer, his eyes swept over the cluttered workspace. Among the mess was a manila folder labeled Reed & Associates. The name immediately caught his attention. He froze, his hand hovering just above Rebecca's purse. "You've been here often, huh?" Emily's voice broke his focus, drawing his gaze back to her. "I mean, Rebecca's always talking about how supportive you are." Elliot forced a chuckle, but the sound felt hollow. "She's lucky to have someone like me, I guess." Emily leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting to something more cautious. "I probably shouldn't say this, but she's been so stressed lately. Meetings with Jackson Reed, late nights. Sometimes I think she's pushing herself too hard." Elliot's heart sank at the casual mention of Jackson's name. "Jackson Reed?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "He seems involved in a lot of her work." "Oh, definitely," Emily replied, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "He's charming, but I get the vibe he's trouble. The kind of guy who thrives on keeping things messy, you know?" Elliot nodded, filing away her words as another piece of a growing puzzle. He shifted his attention back to the desk, his eyes narrowing on a hotel keycard partially tucked beneath a pile of documents. The same logo, Haven Crest Resort. The discovery felt like a punch to the gut. Emily stood, stretching after hours at her computer. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. Rebecca should be back soon." "Thanks, Emily," Elliot said, his voice calm despite the fire raging beneath the surface. As she stepped away, he subtly slipped the keycard into his pocket. His pulse quickened, his thoughts racing. Later, Elliot met Laura at a small cafe downtown. The cozy space felt like a world away from the chaos of his unraveling marriage, but the weight of his discoveries followed him like a shadow. Laura's brow furrowed as he laid out the keycard, the photos, and Emily's offhand remarks. "This isn't just about an affair anymore," Laura said, her voice sharp. "If Rebecca's tied up with someone like Jackson, this could get dangerous." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what's worse, the thought of her betraying me or the idea that she might be in over her head." Laura reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "You need to be careful, Elliot. If Jackson's as manipulative as he seems, this could spiral out of control." The conversation lingered in his mind as he returned home that evening. Rebecca was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The sight struck a chord in him, a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by the memory of Jackson's face and the lies she was weaving. "You're quiet tonight," Rebecca said, her tone light as she handed him a plate. "Rough day?" Elliot forced a smile, the effort leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "Just a lot on my mind." She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "Well, I'm here if you need to talk." The irony of her words almost made him laugh, but he swallowed the impulse, nodding instead. "Thanks." As they sat down to eat, Elliot couldn't shake the image of the keycard, now hidden in his desk drawer. The secrets beneath the surface were growing heavier, threatening to pull them both under. He knew he was running out of time. Whatever was happening between Rebecca and Jackson, it was bigger than he'd imagined, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Elliot paced the living room, the weight of the day pressing on his chest. The keycard from the hotel, the photographs of Rebecca and Jackson, the murmurs of doubt and betrayal, they were all gnawing at him. He had thought about confronting her, demanding answers, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the deep, suffocating love he still had for her. Either way, he knew he wasn't ready to shatter the fragile facade of their marriage just yet. Rebecca was in the kitchen, humming a soft tune as she prepared dinner. Her presence, once a comfort, now felt like an encroaching silence. The woman he had built his life with was now a stranger, and every moment spent with her felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation that he could no longer avoid. "Elliot," Rebecca called, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, a questioning look on her face. "Is everything okay? You've been quiet." "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, long day at work." She nodded, but her eyes searched his face as though looking for something she couldn't quite place. "If you're upset about something, we should talk." The offer hung in the air between them. He could feel it, the tension, thick and palpable. The easy banter they once shared now felt like an act. He swallowed hard, weighing his options. He had the evidence, everything he needed to confront her, to finally shatter the wall of lies between them. But instead of speaking, he said nothing. The silence stretched, and he saw a flicker of relief in her eyes as she turned back toward the stove. "You're sure?" she asked, her tone softening. "I don't like seeing you like this." "I'm fine," he replied, but the words felt empty. He wasn't fine, and they both knew it. As she finished setting the table, Elliot's mind raced. He wanted to break free of the suffocating grip of uncertainty, but part of him feared what the truth might mean. The hotel keycard, the secret meetings. Everything was pointing to the same conclusion. But what if he was wrong? What if he confronted her and found out that everything was just a misunderstanding? But deep down, he knew the answer. He had already seen the signs, felt the growing distance. Rebecca had pulled away, and Jackson Reed was no innocent bystander. The lies had been building for too long, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. Dinner was served in silence. They sat across from each other at the table, the clink of silverware the only sound in the room. Elliot couldn't help but notice how different she seemed, detached, almost as if she were on autopilot. She wasn't the woman he had married, and the thought made his stomach twist. "You've been working a lot lately," Elliot said, trying to fill the silence with casual conversation. "How's the new project going?" Rebecca looked up, her eyes briefly meeting his before darting away. "It's fine," she said quickly, her voice flat. "Busy, but nothing I can't handle." He studied her closely, watching for any signs of guilt, but she appeared too composed, too controlled. It was then that he realized how much he had let this go on, how much he had ignored for the sake of peace. He had allowed her to slip away without fighting for the truth, but tonight, he knew it had to happen. He couldn't keep living in this lie. After dinner, as they both cleared the table, Elliot's phone buzzed. It was a message from Laura. "Be careful," it read. "If you're going to confront her, make sure you have all your facts straight. Don't let her twist it." His heart clenched at the words. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew deep down that Laura was right. Rebecca would twist it. She would lie, and Elliot for the first time felt like he was about to face something far darker than just an affair. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, taking a deep breath as he turned toward her. "Rebecca, I need to talk to you." She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "What about?" The words stuck in his throat. He had everything ready, everything he needed to confront her. And yet, as he looked at her, his resolve faltered. He couldn't do it. Not tonight. I don't know what's happening anymore," he said, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "Something feels off, and I don't know how to fix it." She walked toward him, her expression softening, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of doubt, of guilt. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded, but in his gut, he knew the truth. This wasn't something they could fix, not without facing the demons lurking beneath the surface. And yet tonight, the confrontation was avoided. For now, Elliot sat at the kitchen table, the evening sun casting a warm glow over the countertop. But the comfort of the light did little to soothe the gnawing tension in his chest. He hadn't spoken to Rebecca all day, the silence between them stretching into something almost suffocating. The air felt thick with unspoken truths, and Elliot couldn't ignore it any longer. The next move was crucial. He couldn't simply confront her with vague suspicions anymore. He needed hard evidence, proof that Rebecca's affair with Jackson Reed wasn't just an emotional escape, but part of something deeper and more dangerous. With his mind set, Elliot picked up the phone. He dialed Laura's number, his thumb hovering as the phone rang through. When she picked up, he didn't waste any time. "I need to know everything about Jackson Reed," Elliot said, his voice tight with urgency. "His past. I need to know what I'm dealing with." There was a pause on the other end before Laura's voice came through, steady and deliberate. "You've made up your mind, haven't you?" "I have to know, Laura, everything. This isn't just about an affair anymore," Elliot said, his words laced with frustration. "There's something else going on here, and I need to understand what Jackson is really up to." "I'll look into it," Laura replied. "I've got some contacts, but this won't be easy. Jackson's not just any lawyer, he's connected." The call ended, but Elliot's mind was already racing. What did she mean by connected? He had known Jackson to be charming and suave, but there had to be more to the man that Rebecca was so willingly entangled with. The more Elliot thought about it, the more it unsettled him. Jackson wasn't just some guy in a suit, he was someone who operated in the shadows, pulling strings with calculated ease. The hours dragged on as Elliot waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity. His thoughts kept drifting back to that night at the cafe, the intimate way Jackson had touched Rebecca's hand, the way they'd shared a conversation that seemed far too familiar. Every moment felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, but each piece led to an even darker picture. It wasn't until late that evening when Laura called back. "I found something," she said, her voice low, almost as if she didn't want anyone overhearing. Jackson Reed wasn't always a lawyer. Before he moved to Asheville, he had a much messier career. His reputation is far from spotless. There are rumors, no facts, of a financial scandal tied to his previous firm in New York. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. What kind of scandal? "It involves embezzlement," Laura said. "The firm went under after some of their clients lost everything. Jackson was named in the lawsuits, but no charges were ever pressed. Everything was quietly swept under the rug. He disappeared from the public eye for a while after that." Elliot leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had suspected Jackson was hiding something, but this was more than he had bargained for. A man with that kind of past wasn't someone you simply brushed aside. "Is that all?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He needed more. He needed to know what kind of danger his wife was truly in. "There's more," Laura continued. "Jackson wasn't just hiding from the law. He was hiding from people who weren't so forgiving. There were threats, whispers that he owed people money, and there was even talk about him being involved with some shady characters. That's why he came here, to start over, to escape the mess he left behind." Elliot rubbed his temples, his mind racing with the new information. Rebecca had always seen Jackson as a charming, ambitious man. But what if she didn't know the full extent of his past? What if she had gotten caught in something far darker than just an affair? "I don't know how deep this goes, Laura," Elliot said quietly, "but I need to stop this before it destroys everything." "I know," Laura replied, "but you can't do this alone, Elliot. You need to confront Rebecca with this, or you'll keep living in the dark. But be careful. Jackson won't take kindly to being exposed, and neither will Rebecca." Elliot hung up, his hands shaking as he processed everything Laura had just told him. The man who had been the object of Rebecca's affection wasn't just a charming lawyer. He was a man with a dangerous past, someone who had hidden from the law, and possibly worse. This wasn't a simple affair anymore. This was something much bigger. Elliot stood up, walking over to the window, staring out into the night. He had spent years building a life with Rebecca, and now it seemed everything he knew about her, about their marriage, was being called into question. Was she aware of Jackson's true nature? Or had she been blind to it, lost in the allure of someone who promised her excitement and escape? One thing was certain, Elliot was no longer the passive observer. This game was about to change, and he would be ready. The silence in the house felt like an electric current, crackling and full of tension. Elliot hadn't expected Rebecca to come home so soon, but there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes tired but sharp. The weight of the unspoken words between them was suffocating, and Elliot could feel it closing in. "Why do you look like that?" Rebecca asked, her voice distant, almost defensive. Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her. The woman he had loved for so long, the woman who had become more of a stranger with each passing day. His eyes dropped to her hand, still adorned with the wedding ring, and the faintest tremor ran through him. Was she still the person he had trusted with his heart? Or had that person long since disappeared? "Who is he, Rebecca?" His voice was steady, but the anger and heartbreak simmered beneath. Rebecca stiffened, her gaze darting to the floor, then back to him. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," Elliot snapped, taking a step closer. "Jackson Reed, I know about the hotel key card, the secret meetings, everything. You've been lying to me this whole time. Why?" She took a step back, her face flushing with a mix of guilt and defensiveness. Elliot held up his hand, silencing her. "I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think you'd betray me. But I've seen the signs, Rebecca, and now I know the truth." Rebecca opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was she calculating how to lie her way out of this? Elliot's hands clenched at his sides. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the weight of the question almost crushing him. "Please, Elliot," she started, her voice shaking, but Elliot cut her off. "How long?" he demanded, each word coming out in a sharp exhale. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "A few months," she admitted quietly. The confession hung in the air, heavy with shame. "But it wasn't what you think. Jackson." "Jackson?" Elliot's voice cracked, disbelief and hurt flooding his words. "Is that who you've been seeing? That man? Do you even know who he is, Rebecca?" "I do," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes desperate. "He's not what you think. I never meant for this to happen, but I've been lonely, Elliot. I've been looking for something I wasn't getting from you." Her words pierced him like daggers. The truth, raw and sharp, hit harder than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just an affair. It was a cry for something that was missing in their marriage, something he had failed to notice or perhaps ignored for too long. Elliot's mind was spinning. His love for her was still there, but so was the betrayal. He had seen the signs, the distance, the secrecy, but hearing her say it aloud made it real. It was no longer a suspicion or a half-formed fear, it was the truth. "You've been seeing him because you're lonely?" Elliot repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened to us, Rebecca? What happened to the love we promised? Did it mean nothing to you?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she took a step toward him, reaching out a trembling hand. "Elliot, I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know how it all went wrong, but Jackson, he made me feel alive again. He made me feel like I mattered." Elliot flinched at her words, his heart sinking even further. The pain of her betrayal twisted inside him. "And you think that justifies everything? That justifies tearing us apart?" Rebecca's shoulders slumped as she broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Elliot. I never wanted this. I don't know how to fix it. I just don't know what to do anymore." Elliot stood there rooted to the spot as her sobs filled the room. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the anger and betrayal clouded his every thought. He had loved this woman with everything he had, and now she was standing before him, broken and guilty, but still not truly sorry for the way she had broken him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Elliot said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've hurt me in a way I never thought possible. I need time, Rebecca. I need time to figure out if I can ever trust you again." The words felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating him, but it was the truth. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do, except to let the silence consume them both. As Rebecca collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, Elliot turned and walked out of the room. His heart shattered with every step. There was no turning back now. Elliot's footsteps echoed in the empty hall of the luxury resort, his mind clouded with the whirlwind of the past few days. Each moment with Rebecca had felt like a fragile thread pulling tighter, ready to snap. But tonight was different. He hadn't planned on confronting her here, not like this, not in a place where everything was supposed to feel fresh and new. But something in him couldn't let it go any longer. His eyes scanned the lobby. He had followed them here, Rebecca and Jackson. His gut told him they would be here. It had been too quiet, too perfect of a setup to be a coincidence. And now, standing in the shadows of the grand entrance, Elliot's heart hammered in his chest, knowing he was about to see the full reality of what had been happening right under his nose. Rebecca and Jackson walked into view, their laughter echoing in the large space, unaware of his presence. The sight hit Elliot like a punch to the stomach. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way she hadn't done in months, her eyes sparkling with something that had been missing from their marriage for far too long. Jackson's arm was casually draped around her, and for a moment Elliot couldn't breathe. The man who had torn his life apart stood right there, smirking as if this was all just a game. It took everything in Elliot not to storm over and confront them right then and there. Instead, he stayed still, hidden in the shadowed corner, his fingers digging into his palms. The anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but so was the ache of betrayal. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about his entire life being turned upside down. He watched as Jackson leaned in, his lips brushing Rebecca's ear as they shared a private joke, oblivious to the destruction they were leaving behind. For a split second, Elliot thought about leaving, about walking away and letting them have their moment. But something stopped him. He couldn't turn back now, not when he was so close to the truth. As the couple moved toward the elevator, Elliot felt his pulse quicken. He had to do this now, or he would never get another chance. Stepping out from the shadows, he approached them, each step echoing in the quiet space. "Rebecca!" he called out, his voice cutting through the air. Both she and Jackson froze, their smiles faltering as they turned toward him. Elliot took a deep breath, his eyes locked on Rebecca. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Rebecca's face drained of color. "Elliot, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I think you know why I'm here," Elliot replied, not breaking eye contact. "I know what's been going on. I know about you and Jackson." Jackson stepped forward, his expression one of mock amusement. "You think you can just waltz in and—" "No," Elliot interrupted, his voice steady now, fueled by the rage and hurt that had been building for so long. "I'm not here to fight with you, Jackson. I'm here for her." Rebecca's gaze flicked nervously to Jackson before returning to Elliot. "Elliot, please." "No, Rebecca, no more lies, no more excuses. I've seen it all, the texts, the hotel card, the stolen moments. You've been lying to me for months, and I deserve to know why." Her lips trembled, and she took a step back. "It wasn't like that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It just happened. I never meant for it to go this far." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "How far, Rebecca? How deep does this go? How much of me was there, and how much of Jackson was just an escape?" Jackson scoffed, but Elliot didn't look at him. His focus remained entirely on Rebecca, on the woman he thought he knew, on the woman who had betrayed him in the most painful way possible. "I've been lonely, Elliot," Rebecca whispered, her voice cracking. "I've been suffocating in this marriage, and I don't know when I started needing him. I didn't mean for you to find out. I didn't want to hurt you." The rawness of her confession hit Elliot harder than he expected. The truth, even if it was painful, was out in the open now. The facade had cracked, and for the first time in a long time, Elliot could see the woman standing before him, broken, vulnerable, and hiding behind the very thing she had been avoiding: honesty. "Why couldn't you just talk to me, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me what you were feeling? I would have tried. I would have tried to make it work." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was too afraid. I didn't want to lose you, but I couldn't live a lie anymore. I didn't know who I was anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of betrayal, and Elliot felt a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion swirl inside him. But one thing was clear: everything he thought he knew about his marriage had been a lie, and now he was standing in the ruins of it. Jackson, seeing the conversation spiraling, stepped forward again, trying to assert control. "You think she's going to choose you? After everything? She's mine now." Elliot turned to face him for the first time, his eyes cold. "No, Jackson, she's not yours, not anymore." Rebecca glanced between them, her face torn. But Elliot knew now. This was no longer about her choosing him. It was about him deciding whether he could ever trust her again. "Stay away from her," Elliot said to Jackson, his voice low and dangerous. The words felt final. The confrontation had unfolded, and now the choice was in his hands. The room was filled with an uneasy silence as Elliot sat across from Rebecca, their unfinished dinner untouched on the table between them. The weight of their last confrontation lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating any chance of normalcy. She had confessed her affair with Jackson Reed, but there was more. A deeper layer of deceit that Elliot hadn't even begun to unravel. He could see it in her eyes. She was holding something back, something even darker than the affair. "Rebecca," Elliot's voice broke through the silence, his words measured but heavy. "This isn't just about him, is it? There's something else you're not telling me." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting away as if the truth itself would hurt too much to face. The nervous shift in her posture told Elliot everything he needed to know. She was scared, but not for the reason he expected. "You think there's more?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elliot, I've told you everything I can. What else is there?" He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I don't believe that for a second. You've been lying to me for months, and now you want me to believe you've told me everything?" Rebecca recoiled, her hand instinctively reaching up to cover her mouth, as though she were trying to keep the words from escaping. I didn't want to hurt you, Elliot, but I don't know how to explain it. Elliot's patience was wearing thin. He had given her every opportunity to come clean, to speak the truth, but she had refused, wrapped in the tangled web of lies she had created. Explain it to me then. Tell me what I don't know. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room, her hands wringing together in nervous tension. Elliot watched her, his heart pounding as he waited for her to speak. She was unraveling, he could see it. But would the truth ever come out? She started, but then faltered. Jackson isn't just some man I fell for. He's been helping me with more than just personal things. She hesitated, as if the next words were too dangerous to say. I've been in financial trouble, Elliot. Jackson, he's been covering some of my debts. He promised he would help me if I did some things for him. Elliot's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about something far worse. What kind of things, Rebecca? He asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. What have you done for him? She crumbled into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The tears that fell now weren't just from guilt. They were from fear, and Elliot could see it. She had gotten herself caught in something much darker than he had imagined. I didn't know it would go this far. I was desperate, Elliot. The bills kept piling up. I didn't know who else to turn to. Elliot's mind was spinning, each new piece of the puzzle making the picture more complicated, more twisted. He had suspected there was more to the story, but this was beyond what he had prepared for. His wife had been involved in something far more dangerous than a simple affair. So Jackson has been blackmailing you? Elliot asked, his voice low, controlled. He couldn't let the panic set in, not yet. He needed to hear her out. I wouldn't call it blackmail, Rebecca said, her voice trembling. He said he was helping me, but I was too blind to see it. He has connections, Elliot. Dangerous people. I've done things I regret. I thought I could handle it, but I'm in too deep now. The weight of her confession hit Elliot like a punch to the stomach. He had suspected Jackson was trouble, but this was something else entirely. Rebecca wasn't just a victim of infidelity. She was a part of something far more dangerous, and now Elliot had to decide what to do with this horrifying truth. Do you know what this means, Rebecca? Elliot's voice was barely a whisper, the shock still settling in his chest. This isn't just an affair. This is manipulation. This is you being used by someone who doesn't care about you, and now I'm caught in the middle of it. I never meant for any of this to happen, she sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to bring you into this mess, but I've been so scared. I didn't know how to get out. Elliot stood up and walked toward her, his own anger and sadness mingling in a storm of emotion. We need to fix this, he said, his voice steady but laced with fear. We need to get you out of this, out of his grip. Rebecca looked up at him, her face tear-streaked and desperate. Please, Elliot, please don't leave me. I know I've messed up, but I need you. I need your help. He stood there for a moment, the weight of her plea hanging in the air. Could he help her? Could he save her from the mess she had gotten herself into, or was it too late? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away, not yet. But as he looked at her, he knew the road ahead would be long and filled with even more lies to uncover. The layers had only just begun to peel back. Elliot stared at Rebecca, his heart torn between the anger and disbelief that had consumed him for days. He had tried to stay calm, tried to process everything, but now, standing in front of her, it all felt like too much to bear. The lies, the betrayal, the secrets. It had all built up to this moment, this breaking point. Why didn't you tell me, Rebecca? His voice cracked, the words feeling foreign as they left his lips. Why did you keep pushing me away? Why didn't you come to me when you were struggling? Rebecca's face twisted with guilt, her eyes red and swollen from the tears she had shed. I didn't want to hurt you. I was ashamed. I thought I could handle it, that I could fix everything on my own, but I couldn't. Elliot let out a bitter laugh, the sound empty and hollow. You think you could fix this? By lying to me? By letting Jackson into our lives? Do you even realize how deep this has gone? I never meant for it to go this far, she said softly, her voice trembling. It started as just an escape, but then it became more than that. And by the time I realized what I was doing, I couldn't stop. Elliot took a step back, his mind spinning. He had never imagined his life would end up like this. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had been lying to him for months. She had betrayed him in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, standing here, he felt like he was drowning in a sea of lies. Do you know what this has done to me, Rebecca? Elliot's voice was low, filled with raw emotion. I don't know who you are anymore. You've changed. You're not the woman I married. Rebecca's face crumpled as she took a hesitant step toward him. Elliot, please, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make it right. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. But the words felt hollow. Love? How could she still say that after everything? How could she possibly love him after what she had done? The trust they had built over the years had been shattered in an instant, and he didn't know if he could ever put the pieces back together. Elliot shook his head, taking another step back. I don't know if I can forgive you, Rebecca. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He had never thought it would come to this, but now he could feel the walls closing in around him, the love he had for her, the connection they had shared. It was all slipping away, piece by piece. Rebecca's voice trembled as she spoke again. Elliot, please, don't give up on us. We can work through this. We've been through so much together. I can change. I'll do whatever it takes to prove it. Elliot stared at her, his chest tight, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that things could go back to the way they were, that they could fix this. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't just about forgiveness anymore. It was about whether he could ever trust her again. You've already broken me, Rebecca, Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she reached for him, but he stepped back, unable to let her touch him. He felt like a stranger in his own life, caught in a storm of pain and betrayal that he couldn't escape. I don't know what to do, he said, his voice raw. I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the realization that things might never be the same. The love they once shared was a distant memory, replaced by the wreckage of lies and deceit. Elliot didn't know if there was any way to salvage it. Rebecca collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. Elliot wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he couldn't. The hurt was too deep, the wounds too fresh. He didn't know how to fix this, and for the first time in their marriage, he wasn't sure if they could ever fix it. Maybe this is the end, Rebecca, Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. Maybe we're just too broken to fix. The silence that followed was deafening, and Elliot felt the weight of his words sinking in. He had never imagined that love could break like this, but now, standing in the ruins of everything they had built, he knew the truth. Elliot sat in the darkened living room, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The words he had spoken to Rebecca earlier still echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake them. Maybe this is the end. Had he meant it? Could he really walk away from everything they had built together? Or was this just another moment of raw emotion that would fade with time? His mind wandered back to the good times, to the quiet moments when their love felt like a bond that nothing could break. The laughter, the shared dreams. They felt so distant now, like a movie he had watched but could no longer remember. The person sitting across from him now was a stranger, and it was the reflection of that stranger in the mirror he couldn't recognize. Rebecca had disappeared upstairs hours ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts. She had begged for his forgiveness, promising to change, to fix everything. But Elliot wasn't sure anymore if he wanted to fix it, or if it was even fixable. He stood and walked to the window, the cold glass pressing against his forehead. Outside, the world seemed unchanged. The city lights twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the turmoil inside his home. How could everything outside remain the same when everything in his life had fallen apart? A soft noise behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to find Rebecca standing at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. Her presence, once so comforting, now made him feel a deep ache in his chest. "I'm sorry, Elliot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know I've ruined everything. I don't know what else to say." Elliot's heart twisted, but his resolve didn't waver. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Rebecca," he said softly, his voice betraying the pain he was trying so desperately to control. "I don't know who you are. I don't know who we are anymore." Her face crumpled as she moved closer, her eyes desperate, pleading for him to say something, anything that would give her a chance. But Elliot couldn't find the words. His mind raced back to the moments before their marriage had turned upside down. The happy moments, the shared hope for the future, the trust, and now all of it had been shattered. "I never meant for this to happen," she sobbed, her voice shaking with guilt. "I was just so lonely, and I didn't know how to fix it. Jackson, he made me feel wanted. He made me feel alive again." The words stung more than they should have. The idea that Jackson, of all people, had filled the void Elliot hadn't even known existed in their relationship felt like a betrayal of a different kind. A betrayal not just of their marriage, but of the bond he thought they shared. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "I was here, Rebecca. I was right here. Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me?" Her hands trembled as she reached out to him, her voice soft, vulnerable. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid that you wouldn't love me anymore if you knew what I was going through." "That's the problem, Rebecca," Elliot said, his voice rising. "You kept shutting me out. You kept hiding things from me. And now I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The silence between them was suffocating. Rebecca stood there, the tears streaming down her face, waiting for him to speak. But what could he say? What could he offer her that would make it right? Elliot looked at her, his heart breaking for the woman he had once loved with all his heart. "I can't fix this, Rebecca. I don't know if I even want to try." The words hit her like a slap and she recoiled, her body trembling with the weight of his rejection. She sank into the chair, her sobs filling the room as Elliot stood motionless, watching her fall apart. Was this the end? The thought echoed in his mind, but a part of him, a small, vulnerable part, still wanted to believe in what they had. But that part was slipping further and further away, drowned by the lies, the betrayal, the weight of everything that had come to light. For the first time in years, Elliot felt lost, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to see which way to go. The path forward seemed too uncertain, too full of doubt. Could he ever rebuild what they had, or had everything they built together been built on shaky ground, just waiting to crumble? "I don't know what to do anymore," Rebecca whispered, breaking through his thoughts. "I don't know how to fix this." Elliot exhaled deeply, the words heavy on his lips. "I don't either," he said softly. "I don't know if we can." The silence that followed was deafening, and in that silence Elliot knew that something irreparable had broken between them. Whether they would ever find their way back to each other, he didn't know, and part of him was terrified to find out. Elliot stood at the edge of the balcony, staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, each one a reminder of the world outside, a world he no longer felt part of. The weight of the past few weeks had settled into his bones, leaving him tired and empty. His marriage, his trust, everything had been shattered, and he couldn't see a way forward. Rebecca had begged for forgiveness, but Elliot wasn't sure if he could give it. The lies, the betrayal, the deception, it was too much. Part of him still loved her, but another part of him had been irreparably damaged. He didn't know if he could ever go back to the way things were, to the woman he thought he knew. But as he stood there in the cool night air, another thought began to form. one that had been brewing inside him for days. The truth, the real truth about everything. It wasn't enough to just know about the affair. He needed to know why. He needed to know the full extent of what had happened, what Rebecca had gotten herself into, and what kind of person Jackson Reed really was. Elliot turned away from the view and walked back inside. Rebecca was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at him with desperate eyes, as if waiting for him to make a decision, to give her the answer she needed. "Elliot," she said softly, her voice breaking, "please, I'm begging you. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to. I want us to be together again. I love you." The words hit him hard, a mixture of guilt and longing flooding through him. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they could put the pieces back together. But the weight of everything she had done, the lies, the betrayal, felt like an anchor pulling him down. "I don't know, Rebecca," he said, his voice heavy. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." She stood up, her hands shaking. "Please, Elliot. I can't lose you. I can't lose us. I'll do anything to make this right. Anything." He looked at her, his mind racing. Could he truly rebuild their life together? Could he find it in himself to trust her again? Or was it too late? Was everything beyond repair? He took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside him. "I need to know everything, Rebecca. I need to understand what happened. I need to know who Jackson really is, what you've been involved in, what you've been hiding from me." Rebecca's face paled, and she took a step back. "What are you talking about?" "I know about your debts. I know about Jackson helping you, about him pulling the strings," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the anger that burned inside him. "I need to know what you've gotten yourself into. I need to know what kind of person Jackson really is, because right now, I don't think I even know you anymore." Rebecca stood silent, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as if she were holding herself together. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to tell you, Elliot. I didn't want you to know how far I'd fallen. I was ashamed. Jackson, he promised he'd help me with my debts, with everything. But I didn't realize how dangerous it was until it was too late." Elliot's heart sank. This wasn't just an affair. It was something far darker, something that had twisted their lives beyond recognition. "Rebecca, do you even realize how deep you're in? How deep we're in now?" She shook her head, tears spilling from her eyes. "I didn't want this, Elliot. I didn't want to drag you into it. I didn't want to hurt you." But it was too late for that. The damage had already been done. Elliot stood there, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The betrayal wasn't just about Jackson. It was about everything Rebecca had hidden from him. The secrets, the lies. It was a maze he couldn't navigate. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Elliot said, his voice breaking with the weight of his own confession. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I don't know if I can rebuild what we had." Rebecca's face twisted in agony as she reached for him. "Please, Elliot, don't give up on us. I'll fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." But Elliot pulled away, stepping back. "No, Rebecca, you don't get to fix this. Not now. Not after everything. This is my decision. I have to decide what comes next." The room fell silent, the tension unbearable. Elliot didn't know what the future held. But one thing was certain. He couldn't make this decision alone. The final gamble was in his hands, and whether he chose to stay or walk away, nothing would ever be the same. Elliot sat in the darkened room, his gaze fixed on the empty chair across from him. It felt like hours had passed since Rebecca left for the night, her departure hanging heavily in the air. The silence between them had become unbearable, yet it was a silence filled with the weight of decisions that needed to be made. His mind kept drifting back to that night, the night she admitted everything, the affair, the debts, Jackson. She had begged him for forgiveness, promised she could change, that she could make it right. But Elliot didn't know if he believed her anymore. The man he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his heart, seemed so far away now. She was a stranger to him. The thought of starting over, of moving past this mess, felt impossible. How could he ever rebuild a life with someone who had torn their world apart so completely? But then again, could he live with the idea of walking away forever, of abandoning what they once shared? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Rebecca. She stood there, hesitant, her face pale but determined. Her eyes met his, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The room was thick with the tension of everything they hadn't yet said. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said softly, her voice raw. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'm asking for a chance to fix this, to fix us." Elliot swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I don't know if I can do that, Rebecca," he whispered. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Rebecca took a step closer, her hand trembling as she reached out toward him. "I understand. I understand if you can't. I've hurt you in ways I can't even explain, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it right. But I'm asking you to at least give me a chance, not just for me, but for us." The words echoed in Elliot's mind. Not just for me, but for us. How could he possibly give her a chance when everything inside him screamed that she didn't deserve it? Yet how could he not when he thought of the life they had once shared, the love they had once had? "I don't know who you are anymore," Elliot said quietly, his eyes closing as the pain of the moment settled in. "I don't know who we are anymore." Rebecca's face crumpled, the guilt and sorrow flooding her features. "I've made so many mistakes, Elliot. I've lied, I've cheated, and I've hurt you more than anyone could ever deserve. But the one thing I haven't done is stop loving you. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll just let me." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to believe her. A part of him still loved her, still yearned for the life they had before everything went wrong. But how could he just ignore everything that had happened? The lies, the secrets, the pain. Could he really put it all behind him? Rebecca wiped the tears from her eyes, stepping closer to him. "I know it's hard. I know I've given you every reason to walk away from me, but I can't stand the thought of losing you. I've lost so much already, Elliot. I don't know if I can live with the guilt of knowing that I lost you too." Elliot looked at her, his chest tight with a mix of emotions. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he could forgive her, but he knew he didn't want to lose her either. Could love really overcome this? Could they rebuild what they once had? "I can't promise anything," Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't promise that I'll be able to forgive you, but I'm not ready to give up yet. Not completely." Rebecca's face softened, her relief palpable. "You don't have to forgive me right now, Elliot. Just give me the chance to show you. Please." Elliot nodded slowly, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure if they could ever go back to the way things were. But he knew that, for now, he needed to try. He needed to see if redemption was possible, not just for her, but for himself. As Rebecca stepped forward and took his hand, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this fragile moment of hope, was a gamble. A final gamble, and he wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that there was a chance, a small, flickering chance, that they could find their way back to each other. Elliot woke up to the sound of rain pattering gently against the window. The light was dim, casting a soft glow over the room as he slowly opened his eyes. His body felt heavy, burdened with the weight of everything he had been through. The past few weeks had felt like an emotional storm, one that had torn through his life and left nothing untouched. He could still feel the remnants of it, the guilt, the pain, the uncertainty. He glanced over at Rebecca, who was still asleep beside him. Her face was peaceful, but there was something in her expression that reminded him of how far they had fallen, how much they had lost. He wanted to believe that they could fix it, that they could rebuild, but he wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. The truth of their situation was staring him in the face, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. Rebecca stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as she turned to meet his gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and a shared understanding that things could never be the same again. "Elliot," her voice was soft, almost hesitant. I know I don't deserve this, but I just want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be the person you need me to be, the person I should have been all along." Elliot took a deep breath, pushing aside the ache in his chest. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, Rebecca. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again, but—" He paused, his thoughts scattered like the rain outside. "But I'm willing to try. For us." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she reached for him. He allowed her to take his hand, and for a moment they simply held each other in silence, both of them unsure of what came next. The road ahead was uncertain. The lies, the betrayal, the debt. They were all pieces of a puzzle that could never be put back together the way it had been. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a new way forward, a way to rebuild the trust they had lost, one step at a time. "We can't change the past," Elliot said, his voice firm but gentle. "But we can control what happens from here. We can choose whether or not we want to try." Rebecca nodded, a small, fragile smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I want to try, Elliot. I want to make it right. I don't want to lose you." Elliot hesitated, his gaze shifting away from her. His heart was torn, pulled between the love he still felt for her and the fear that she might break his heart all over again. How could he trust her? How could he ever trust someone who had lied to him for so long? But then something shifted, a glimmer of hope, small but undeniable. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting everything that had happened. Maybe it was about finding a way to move forward, even with the pain, even with the uncertainty. "We take it one day at a time," Elliot said, his voice steady. "We start fresh, no more lies, no more secrets." Rebecca nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "I promise, no more secrets." For the first time in weeks, Elliot felt a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would work out, but it was a chance to rebuild, to find a way to heal. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, or maybe it was the end. "I'll be here," Elliot said, his voice steady but his heart still unsure. "But you need to show me that I can trust you again, that we can fix this, together." Rebecca's face softened as she leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. "I will, Elliot, I swear, I'll do whatever it takes." The rain continued to fall outside, but in that moment it felt like the world was holding its breath. They were at a crossroads, and neither of them knew what the future would bring. But for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt like there was a chance, however small, that they could find their way back to each other. As the day began to break, the light creeping through the curtains, Elliot couldn't help but wonder, would they make it through this, or would this be the final goodbye? Only time would tell. The first rays of dawn slipped through the curtains, casting soft beams of light across the room. Violet lay awake in the quiet stillness, her heart still racing from the night before. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts too scattered, her mind too preoccupied with what had transpired. It wasn't that everything had suddenly become perfect, far from it. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were many questions that lingered, unanswered and unspoken. But for the first time in weeks, Violet felt a glimmer of hope. Jason hadn't walked away. He hadn't given up, and that was enough, for now. She turned her head to look at him, Jason, still asleep beside her. His features were soft in the early light, the tension that had once been a permanent fixture in his face now replaced by something gentler, though not yet free from the weight of all that had happened. Violet studied him carefully, feeling a sense of wonder mixed with uncertainty. They had come so far, but it wasn't just about repairing the damage that had been done. No, it was something deeper than that. It was about starting over, building something new, something real. And that was no easy task. As if sensing her gaze, Jason stirred. He blinked his eyes open, and for a moment there was a hesitation in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, of wondering if this was really the right thing to do. He met her gaze, and she could see it in his eyes. He was still scared, still unsure, still carrying the scars of the past. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep, but filled with a sincerity that sent a shiver down her spine. "For everything." Violet didn't know what to say. She had heard those words before, but they had never felt quite like this. They weren't just an apology for the lies, for the mistakes. No, these words were a promise that maybe, just maybe, they could move forward together. "You don't have to apologize," she whispered, her voice tender. "I'm the one who's sorry, for hurting you, for everything." Jason's hand reached out, gently brushing against hers, the simple touch a comfort, a reminder that they were still here, still connected. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "One step at a time." Violet nodded, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of relief. After everything they had been through, after all the pain and the silence, they were finally taking the first steps toward healing, together. Later that morning, the sun high in the sky, they found themselves walking side by side through the park. It was a quiet, almost surreal experience, as if they had stepped out of the chaos of the past and into something new, something uncharted. They didn't speak much, but there was a comfort in the silence, a quiet understanding between them that didn't need words. "I've been thinking," Violet said after a while, breaking the silence, "about everything, about us. And I know we have a long way to go, but I don't want to waste any more time. I want to rebuild. I want to be the person you deserve." Jason looked at her, his eyes searching. "You already are." Her heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never been one to believe in fairy tales or perfect endings, but in that moment, with him by her side, she could almost imagine it. A future where they could leave the past behind, where they could heal piece by piece. "You're not just saying that to make me feel better, are you?" she asked, half joking but also half serious. He shook his head, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, I mean it." For the first time in a long while, Violet felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had always believed that love was something worth fighting for, even when it seemed impossible. And here they were, both of them bruised and scarred, but still standing, still willing to try. "You know, I think we've both made our fair share of mistakes," she said quietly. "But that's not the end of our story, is it?" "No," Jason replied, his voice steady. "It's just the beginning." As the days passed, Violet and Jason began to build their new reality, brick by brick. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of uncertainty, moments when the shadows of the past threatened to creep back in, but each day they learned to trust each other a little more. Each day they learned that it was okay to be vulnerable, to admit their fears, and to embrace the uncertainty together. One evening, as they sat on the couch, the TV muted in the background, Violet leaned her head against Jason's shoulder. It had been a quiet, uneventful evening, and for the first time in ages, that was enough. "I don't have all the answers," she murmured, her voice soft, "but I know I want to try. With you." Jason's arm wrapped around her, pulling her closer, his lips brushing against the top of her head. "Me too," he whispered. And in that moment, Violet realized something profound. This wasn't the end of their story. It wasn't the end of their love. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to learn how to love each other better. The road ahead would still be difficult. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of pain. But there would also be moments of joy, of laughter, of love. Together, they could face whatever came their way. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Violet held on to the one thing that mattered most: hope.